You call your mom on a Sunday. You ask if she's eaten, how the weather's been, whether she's taken her tablets. She asks the same of you. You hang up 20 minutes later, warm but a little empty, both of you having said nothing you couldn't have said to a stranger. It's not that the love isn't there. It's that the real conversation keeps waiting for a better time that never quite arrives. Before we go further, a gentle note. This is general educational information about connection and later life, not medical or psychological advice, and not a substitute for talking with a doctor or a qualified professional about your family's particular situation. Think of the next few minutes as a warm nudge, not a set of instructions. Now, most of us know the conversations we're supposed to have with an aging parent. The practical ones. Money, wishes, plans, the paperwork of later life. Those matter, and there's a time for them. But this video isn't about any of those. It's about a different conversation entirely. One that's warmer, easier, and strangely, one that hardly anyone tells you is worth having. It's simply this: asking your parent to tell you the story of their own life, and then actually listening. That might sound almost too simple to count. But stay with me, because there's more underneath it than you'd expect. Somewhere along the way, most of us stop seeing our parents as whole people. It happens gradually and without any bad intent. They become, in our minds, mainly a role: mom, dad. The person who raised you, who worries about you, who asks if you've eaten. And in the day-to-day, the conversation shrinks to fit that role. Logistics, health updates, the small, kind, surface things. But your parent was a whole person long before they were yours. They were young once, with a life you weren't in. They had a first job, a first heartbreak, a moment they were proud of and never quite got to tell anyone about. They made choices, took risks, feared things, hoped for things. There is, inside the person who asks whether you're dressing warmly enough, an entire life you've mostly never heard. Think about that for a second. Your parent has a version of themselves at your age, facing things you may be facing now, that you've probably never asked about. They knew people who are gone. They lived through events that are history to you, but ordinary Tuesdays to them. They carried dreams they may have set down quietly, and some they may have quietly kept. All of it is still in there. Most of it has simply never been invited out. And here's the part that turns this from a nice idea into something worth taking seriously. Researchers who study aging have a name for the act of looking back over one's life and making sense of it. They call it life review. The psychiatrist Robert Butler, who first described it in the 1960s, argued that this looking back isn't idle nostalgia or a sign of decline. It's a natural, healthy, and important process in later life, a way of finding meaning and coherence in the whole arc of a life lived. Reminiscing, in other words, isn't your parent drifting. For many older people, it's meaningful work. What's striking is that this process seems to want a listener. A life reviewed entirely in private is one thing, but a life told aloud, to someone who cares enough to ask and to stay, is something richer. The telling gives the memories shape, and the person listening becomes, quietly, part of how that life gets to be understood and remembered. That's a role almost no one else can play the way a child can. And this connects to something we've touched on before. Research by the psychologist Laura Carstensen has found that as people move through later life, they tend to place more value on emotionally meaningful experiences and close relationships. In other words, a real conversation with someone they love isn't a small thing to an older parent. It may be exactly the kind of thing that matters most to them now. So when you invite your parent to tell their story and you truly listen, you may be offering something that research suggests is genuinely good for them, not a burden. Not an imposition. A gift that happens to look like a conversation. And it isn't only for them. The child who listens often comes away with something they didn't know they were missing. A fuller picture of where they come from. Answers to questions they hadn't quite formed. A parent who becomes, in their eyes, more human, more forgivable, more admired. These conversations have a way of quietly rearranging things for both people at the table. But let's be honest about why we don't do it. Because the reasons are real and worth naming gently. The first is simply drift. Life is busy. Calls get squeezed between other things. It always feels like there'll be time for the deeper conversation later, on some less hurried day that keeps not coming. This is the quiet thief. Not unwillingness, just the endless postponement of ordinary life. The second is that it can feel awkward. If your relationship has run on logistics for years, suddenly asking, "What were you like at 20?" can feel strange, even for both of you. That awkwardness is normal. It usually lasts about one question before something in your parent softens and opens. Most people are quietly delighted to be asked about themselves, especially by someone whose opinion they care about as much as yours. The awkwardness is almost always yours to push through, and it's almost always brief. And the third, the quietest one, is that it can bring up feelings. Realizing you don't know your parent as fully as you'd like, or noticing that time is not unlimited, can stir something tender. If that rises for you, it's worth sitting with gently. And if it ever feels heavier than that, a conversation with a counselor or someone you trust can help. This kind of reflection is meant to bring you closer, not to weigh you down. So how do you actually begin? Not with a grand announcement. You don't sit your parent down and declare that it's time for the big conversation. That tends to make everyone tense. You begin small and sideways and warm. You might ask about a specific time rather than their whole life. What was the house you grew up in like? How did you and Dad actually meet, the real version? What were you like as a teenager? What's something you did back then that I'd never guess? Specific questions are easier to answer than enormous ones, and they tend to open doors on their own. You might reach for an object, an old photo, a piece of music from their youth, a recipe. These things carry memory, and they give a conversation somewhere gentle to start. Hand your dad a photograph and ask who everyone in it was, and you may get a story you'd never have thought to ask for. Play a song from the year your mom was 20 and watch where her mind goes. Objects do the awkward work of starting for you. And then, the most important part, and the hardest, you listen. Really listen, without steering, without rushing to the next thing, without turning it back to yourself. You let there be pauses. You ask, and then what happened? You let your parent be, for a little while, not your parent, but the whole and interesting person they have always been. You may find they light up in a way you haven't seen in years. You may hear a story that reorganizes how you understand your own childhood, your own family, even yourself. People often say that in these conversations they learned something that changed everything, and that they only wish they'd started sooner. Now, a gentle word before we close. Every family is different. Some relationships carry real pain, old wounds, or estrangement. And for those, a warm chat about the past isn't simple, and may not be the right step at all. This video isn't meant to gloss over that. If your relationship with a parent is complicated, be gentle with yourself about what's possible, and know that a therapist or counselor can help you think through what, if anything, feels right for you. There's no obligation here, and no single correct way to be a good child. And there's no promise being made, either about outcomes or healing or how any particular conversation will go. What research points to is simpler and quieter than that. That looking back on a life tends to be meaningful for older people, that close relationships matter more in later years, and that being truly listened to is a rare and valuable thing to offer someone you love. So where does this leave you? On an ordinary week? With a phone you could pick up? Perhaps just with a small, warm idea. That the next call doesn't have to be only about tablets and weather. That somewhere in your parent is a whole life you were never fully told, and that you are, quite possibly, the person they would most love to tell it to. Not as a task, not out of duty, just because the story is there, and so are you, and the two of you still have time to reach past the surface. You don't need the perfect moment. You just need one small question, and the willingness to really hear the answer. And maybe that's the quiet mercy in all of this. The conversation worth having asks so little of you. Not money, not expertise, not the right words at the right time. Just curiosity and attention, and a willingness to let your parent surprise you. Those are things you already have. The only thing standing between you and the story is the ordinary momentum of a busy life, and momentum, unlike time, is something you can choose to interrupt. One question, on one ordinary call, is enough to begin. If this stirred something in you, there's a good chance it would for someone else. A sibling, a friend, anyone who has a parent growing older, and a call they keep meaning to make different. Consider sending it their way. And then come back and tell me, in the comments, one thing you'd love to ask your own parent, or something you're glad you already did. I read every one of these, and these particular stories always stay with me. One last time, gently, because it matters. What we've talked about today is general information, not medical or psychological advice, and every family and every parent is different. If any of this brings up something difficult, or if you have concerns about a parent's health or your own well-being, please talk with a doctor or a qualified professional who can support you properly. Because in the end, the conversation worth having isn't the heavy one we're all told to dread. It's the warm one, the one where you simply ask and listen and let the person who raised you tell you who they've been all along.